The alley smelled like sour milk and something worse Blake couldn't name. Garbage bags lined the walls like swollen, rotting beasts, some torn open with their insides spilling out. Moldy bread, rusted cans, cigarette butts. He pulled his hoodie tighter around his thin frame, the sleeves nearly swallowing his hands. It was the only sweater he owned, passed down from a cousin 2 years older and twice his size. It was too big, too thin, and not warm enough for late October, but it was all he had. Blake Turner was 8 years old and knew how to stay quiet. He had learned early that the Bronx didn't care much for loud children or slow ones. You kept your head down, moved fast, and tried not to make eye contact with anyone you didn't know. That night he was cutting through back streets, trying to get home before the streetlights flickered on. His mom hated when he came home after dark, especially on nights when she worked late and couldn't be there to lock the door behind him. Maria Turner worked long hours as a cleaner for an office building downtown. Sometimes she came home with the smell of bleach still on her hands. She left early, came home late, and worried about Blake constantly. But worry didn't pay rent. Worry didn't buy bread or keep the gas running. Blake walked faster, clutching the comic book he'd spent 2 weeks saving for. He didn't see them at first, the 2 men at the end of the alley. One stood with his back against the wall, his shoulders tense. The other loomed closer, hands in his coat pockets. Blake froze. The man in the coat said something too low for Blake to hear. The second man answered, his voice trembling. Blake took a step back, hoping they wouldn't notice him, and he could retreat the way he came. His foot landed on a crushed soda can. The metallic crunch echoed like a firework in the narrow alley. The man in the coat turned his head, but didn't move. Then it happened. It was fast, almost silent. A sharp movement, a glint of something silver. The man with his back to the wall gasped, stumbled forward, then dropped. He didn't scream, just collapsed like his strings had been cut. The attacker knelt beside him for a second, then got up and calmly walked away, brushing his coat like he was straightening his sleeves after a subway ride. He passed within 10 feet of Blake and didn't even blink. His eyes were cold, glassy, like he'd done this before. Blake couldn't move. His feet were stuck to the ground. His heart pounded like it was trying to beat its way out of his chest. A man had just been killed right in front of him, and the killer had walked away like it meant nothing. When Blake finally got home, he didn't say a word. He sat on the edge of the worn couch, staring blankly ahead, until his mom came home 3 hours later. She found him there, the comic book crumpled in his hands. He didn't tell her what he saw. He couldn't. But he stopped reading comics after that. The police came around a week later, knocking on doors in the building. They asked questions, flashed photos. A man had been murdered in that alley, they said. Nobody knew anything, of course. The neighborhood had a code. Snitches got stitches, or worse. But Blake knew. He recognized the photo of the man who'd been killed. And he knew he'd never forget the face of the man who did it. When they walked out of his apartment without asking him a single thing, Blake realized something terrifying. No one was going to stop that man. No one even suspected he existed. The case disappeared like most in his neighborhood did. No leads, no arrests. Another death in a forgotten corner of the city, but not to Blake. Not in his head. That was the day something in him shifted. He'd always known the world wasn't fair, but watching someone take a life and walk away with no consequence, that burned a hole in him. It filled him with a quiet rage he didn't know what to do with. He started watching people differently after that, looking for patterns, trying to read expressions. He listened when his mom talked about her coworkers, memorizing the way people lied without realizing it. Blake Turner was just a boy, but already something else had begun to grow inside him, a deep, obsessive need to see justice served. Not just justice, real justice. By the time he turned 10, he knew what he wanted to be. Not a superhero, not a vigilante, a detective, not someone who carried a gun and barked orders, but someone who found the truth when no one else could. Someone who made sure killers didn't walk free just because nobody was watching. He didn't know it yet, But one day the city would come to know his name, and one day someone would come for him too. But for now, he was just the boy in the alley, and he had seen everything. Blake Turner never forgot the alley. Not the stench of rotting garbage, not the flash of silver in the dark, and definitely not the man's face as he bled out onto broken glass and damp concrete. Even as he grew, that memory clung to him like a shadow. While other kids played basketball or got into trouble, Blake was reading crime novels, memorizing police procedures, and studying case files he could get his hands on from old newspapers. The other kids called him strange, obsessed, but he didn't care. He wasn't trying to be popular. He was trying to be ready. By the time he turned 16, he was already volunteering at the local precinct, running errands, making coffee, and hanging around just long enough to overhear the rhythms of real detectives. He absorbed everything, how they questioned suspects, how they read a crime scene, how they argued over motives and timelines. He wasn't even out of high school when one of the older detectives, a grizzled vet named Ramos, handed him a cold case folder and said, half-joking, "If you're going to keep hanging around here, you might as well do some real work." Blake solved it in a week. He spotted something everyone else missed, an inconsistency in a witness statement buried in the middle of the report. That detail cracked the case open. They made an arrest. Ramos didn't laugh when he looked at Blake again. "Kid," he said, "you've got a sick brain. You're going to make one hell of a detective." Blake never forgot that. After high school, he enrolled in John Jay College of Criminal Justice, full ride, top of his class. While others drank or skipped lectures, Blake was poring over crime scene photos, mastering behavioral analysis, and writing papers on criminal psychology that professors said bordered on obsessive. That word again, obsessive. But obsession was how he survived. It was how he stayed sharp. And by the time he graduated and entered the academy, he was more prepared than most of the instructors. He crushed every training course. He ran faster, shot straighter, and memorized procedures with military precision. He wasn't just motivated, he was possessed. He didn't want a badge because it looked good. He wanted it because it meant he could finally do something when he saw evil walk free. By 26, Blake Turner made detective. Young. Too young, some said. But when he cracked 3 major robbery cases within his first 6 months, the whispers stopped. Then came the real tests, murders, disappearances. He was thrown into the deep end, and instead of drowning, he swam circles around veterans twice his age. He worked long hours, skipped meals, and tore through case files with a red pen and a 1,000-yard stare. What made him special wasn't luck, it was instinct. He could walk into a room and feel what happened. He didn't just see evidence, he felt the absence of what was missing. His mind worked in layers, asking questions no one else thought to ask. "Turner doesn't solve cases," one officer once joked. "He reads their minds." But there was truth in it. He broke down suspects with a calm, unblinking presence that made them crack. He visited victims' families long after other officers had moved on, driven not by protocol, but by the belief that they deserved peace. He was relentless. Some said too much, but no one denied his results. One case involved a missing girl in Queens. Everyone assumed she'd run away. Her backpack was found at a train station. Case closed, they thought. Blake didn't buy it. He went back to the footage, frame by frame, until he noticed a man in a delivery uniform walking too close. The man didn't match the delivery logs. Turned out he wasn't a delivery man at all. He had a record in another state, hidden under a new name. Blake got a warrant, kicked in the door, and found the girl in a locked basement, alive. After that, Blake wasn't just respected. He was feared in the way people fear a storm they can't control. Criminals knew his name. So did other departments. "Call Turner," they'd say. "If anyone can crack it, he can." But with each victory, the weight on his shoulders grew. because for every case he solved, there were more waiting, more killers slipping through cracks he couldn't see. He remembered the man from the alley, the one who walked free, and some nights when he couldn't sleep. Blake wondered how many others were out there, just like him, walking past boys like him, disappearing into the night. He didn't smile often, he didn't date, he barely even took time off. Blake Turner had traded a childhood for a mission, and the closer he got to justice, the further peace seemed to drift. But the city needed him, and he needed to catch monsters, because if he didn't, who would? It was a gray Thursday in late October, 1987. Cold had crept into the city like a thief, and the wind off the Hudson was sharp enough to cut through layers. The trees lining the sidewalks were half naked, their brittle leaves scattered across the streets like fallen soldiers. Halloween decorations flapped in the breeze, ghosts taped to windows, plastic pumpkins on stoops. But the mood in the precinct that evening was anything but festive. Detective Blake Turner clocked in just after 6 p.m., as usual. He wore his old leather coat, scuffed at the sleeves, carried his black notebook, the one he never went anywhere without. Coffee in one hand, badge clipped tight to his belt, and that same steel-eyed look he always wore. Focused, controlled, dead serious. It was supposed to be a quiet shift, just routine patrol work and follow-ups. He told his partner, Mitchell Hayes, that he'd go check out a lead alone, a vague tip from an informant about something strange near Pier 42. Probably nothing, he said. But I'll take a look. Hayes offered to ride with him, but Blake shook his head. One of us should stay back in case something else comes in. I'll call it in if it's anything. That was the last time anyone saw Blake Turner alive. At 8:42 p.m., dispatch logged a check-in from his radio. Calm, normal. 10:22 at Pier 42, just doing a sweep, then silence. At 9:15, the desk sergeant radioed him for a status update. No answer. They tried again. Nothing. At 9:45, a cruiser was sent to the pier. They found Blake's unmarked patrol car parked facing the Hudson. The engine was still running. The driver's door was closed. The headlights were off. Inside, everything was intact. Radio, flashlight, clipboard, even a half-eaten granola bar in the cup holder. But Blake was gone. At first, no one panicked. Officers figured he'd wandered off, maybe got into something and needed backup. But when they canvassed the area, warehouses, piers, alleys, they found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no shell casings, no witnesses, just an eerie stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. By midnight, the NYPD had launched a full-scale search. Boats swept the river. K-9 units combed the surrounding blocks. Helicopters buzzed above the city, spotlights cutting through the dark like blades. The next morning, it was on every front page. Decorated detective missing, city on edge leads came in by the dozen. Crackpots, psychics, tips from people just looking for attention. The department chased every one of them, but none led anywhere. Blake Turner had vanished like smoke in the wind. For 2 weeks, the city held its breath. The department worked around the clock. Officers didn't take days off. Flyers went up. Press conferences were held. His mother, Maria, appeared on television once, her voice trembling, eyes red and hollow, begging for any information. "He's a good man," she said. "Please just bring him home." And then, on the 16th day, they found him. A tugboat operator spotted something floating near the shoreline, south of Battery Park. At first, they thought it was debris, until the body turned in the current. The operator called it in. 2 harbor officers pulled the bloated corpse from the water. It was naked. No wallet, no badge, no clothes. The face was barely recognizable, swollen, bruised. But the fingerprints matched. It was Blake Turner. The autopsy brought no answers, just more questions. No gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force trauma, no water in his lungs, no drugs in his system. Cause of death, undetermined. The medical examiner wrote it in bold ink, underlined twice, as if trying to convince himself it wasn't a mistake. The body had been in the water for some time, but not enough to wash away everything. Whatever had happened to Blake, it had left no trace. The NYPD was rattled to its core. Cops who'd worked with Blake for years couldn't believe it. He was too sharp, too careful, too good. He didn't just vanish, and he definitely didn't die like that. It didn't make sense. Some whispered about internal sabotage. Others spoke of an enemy Blake had gotten too close to, a case he shouldn't have touched. But nothing fit. His apartment showed no signs of struggle. His case files were in order. The last week of his notes had nothing out of the ordinary, just routine follow-ups and names crossed off with red ink. No red flags, no warnings. The funeral was massive. Officers from 3 states came to pay their respects. Bagpipes cried, badges were draped in black. His mother sat front row, stone-faced, as the honor guard folded the flag over her son's coffin and handed it to her with trembling hands. She didn't cry. Not until the very end, when the coffin began to lower and she whispered, "They didn't beat you, baby. They just cheated." Blake Turner was gone, and the city felt colder without him. But the worst part wasn't his death. It was the silence that followed. No answers, no arrests, no justice, just an open file, a cold case, a hero buried, and a city wondering how its sharpest mind could vanish without even a trace of a scream. For a time, Blake Turner's death was all anyone in the NYPD could talk about. Detectives who had never even met him pored over his files. Beat cops who once nodded respectfully in passing now found themselves standing outside his locker, staring at it like a headstone. Rumors bloomed like mold in the cracks of silence. Everyone had a theory. Maybe he was working a secret case, something off the books. Maybe he got too close to someone powerful. Maybe it was someone from inside the department. Maybe Blake Turner had made the wrong enemy. But for all the whispered possibilities, there were no facts, no suspects, no footage, no confirmed witnesses, only a dead detective and a pile of broken hopes. The lead investigator on Blake's case, a seasoned officer named Daniel Vega, gave it everything he had. For weeks he barely left the precinct. He interrogated the informant Blake was scheduled to meet that night, scoured surveillance tapes, and even sent divers back into the Hudson to search for discarded evidence. Nothing turned up. "We missed something," Vega muttered more than once. "We had to." But time has a cruel way of eroding urgency. The longer Blake's case sat without progress, the more it began to rot, slowly, quietly. What started as a department-wide emergency became one unsolved case among many. 6 months in, the file sat in Vega's drawer, unopened. That was when the first whispers started, not from criminals, but from inside the department itself. Some said Blake had been investigating a ring of dirty cops. Others claimed he'd found something dangerous, something that someone inside didn't want exposed. Then came the suggestion that Blake hadn't been killed at all, that he'd staged his own death for reasons no one could explain. Vega hated those theories. They stank of defeat. But he couldn't silence them, because, in truth, nothing made sense. The press didn't help. Newspapers ran editorials hinting at scandal. One headline read, "Was justice too close to the truth?" Another, "Detective Turner, victim or sacrifice?" Soon the commissioner made a quiet decision. Blake Turner's badge would be retired, not as an honor, but as a formality, a signal. The case was cold. Vega was livid. "He deserves better than this," he told his captain. "We don't bury questions with the body." But policy didn't care about grief. There were other cases, other murders, other families still waiting for answers. The world didn't pause, not even for the best of them. Eventually, the precinct cleared Blake's desk. His things were packed into a plain cardboard box. His notebook, a cracked mug, a pair of reading glasses, and a photo of his mother tucked into the bottom drawer. No one wanted to carry the box. In the end, Officer Hayes, his old partner, volunteered. He didn't say anything, just held the box to his chest like it was made of glass. They held a small ceremony when his badge was encased in glass and mounted on the precinct's memorial wall. A framed portrait hung above it, Blake staring out with that quiet intensity, the kind that made you believe he could see the truth even if you couldn't. The city moved on. It always does. New crimes needed solving. New officers came in. Some of them only knew Blake Turner as a story, part legend, part ghost. A cautionary tale told during late shifts or in whispered hallway conversations. But not everyone forgot. Detective Vega kept the case file in his drawer, despite being reassigned. Some nights he opened it, hoping fresh eyes might catch what he missed. He'd reread the reports, revisit the photos, try to imagine what Blake saw that night. Why had he gone alone? Why Pier 42? Why take his clothes? Why leave no mark? None of it added up. Blake's mother never stopped calling. Once a month without fail, she'd phone the precinct. "Any news?" she'd ask. And every time the answer was the same. "We're still working on it, ma'am." It was a lie. A kind one, but a lie nonetheless. The years passed. The neighborhood where Blake grew up changed. Old storefronts were replaced by cafes. The building where he and his mother had lived was eventually torn down, replaced by condos. The alley where he'd seen his first murder was now a parking lot. But the case never went away. Not really. It just sat beneath the surface, like a wound that never closed. Sometimes a new detective would open the file, read it, and feel that old frustration stir. They'd try something, track down a name, recheck a lead. But the trail always ended the same way it began, in silence. What haunted everyone the most wasn't just that he was gone. It was how he'd gone. Blake Turner had made a life out of seeing what others missed, of dragging secrets into the light, and yet, when it was his turn to be found, there was only darkness, no motive, no closure, no face to pin to the nightmare. His death became a mirror, showing everyone in the department that no one, not even the sharpest mind among them, was untouchable. They called him a hero, a martyr, a mystery. But to a few, to Vega, to Hayes, to his mother, he was still just Blake. The man who refused to let killers walk, the man who deserved more than silence. And somewhere, in the cracks of the city's memory, his story still waited to be finished. It started in 1991, almost 4 years to the day since Detective Blake Turner's body was pulled from the Hudson. By then, the city had changed. Graffiti was getting cleaned off the subway cars. Crime was down, at least on paper, and for the most part, the city had tucked Blake's story away, like an old scar people stopped noticing. Then the bodies started showing up. The first was a cab driver named Eli Roman. He was found slumped over the hood of his own taxi on a side street in Brooklyn, throat slit, eyes wide open, with both hands placed neatly on the steering wheel. The scene looked like a robbery gone wrong until they saw the message spray-painted across the windshield, in red. "Nice try." The second victim was a deli worker, 62 years old, stabbed 12 times in the walk-in freezer of his shop in Queens. Police found bloody boot prints leading out the back door, clear as day. The killer hadn't even tried to hide them. On the freezer door was a new message, carved with something sharp and jagged. "Warmer." The third was a teenage girl, a runaway, found in an abandoned laundromat on the Lower East Side. Her body was surrounded by a circle of bleach bottles and broken mirrors. A single black and white photo had been left tucked under her arm, an image of the crime scene from the first murder. On the back, scribbled in ink, "You're following me now." The media had a field day. By the end of the week, they had a name for him, the Laughing Man, not because he laughed, but because he made everyone else feel like the joke was on them. Detectives quickly realized the killings were connected. The messages, the public staging, the pattern of creating crime scenes that looked messy on the surface, but were, upon closer inspection, painfully precise. He left clues, almost daring them to catch him, fingerprints on doorknobs, shoe prints in fresh blood, surveillance camera footage that showed only a shadowed silhouette. He wanted them to find him, or at least think they could. But every time they followed a lead, it fell apart. Fingerprints came back to dead people. Boot prints matched sizes that didn't exist. Camera footage showed nothing at all when reviewed on official channels, just static and flickering light. The killer wasn't just mocking the police. He was puppeteering them, like a magician performing a trick where the audience didn't even realize they were part of the act. The precinct was in chaos. Old-timers who'd worked the Turner case started drawing comparisons. The river, the silence, the lack of motive. But no one wanted to say it out loud that maybe this new killer knew something about the one they had failed to catch. Detective Daniel Vega, now a few years older and a few pounds heavier, dusted off Blake's cold case and started to see parallels. They were subtle, like fingerprints on fogged glass. But they were there. Each new crime scene had something just slightly familiar, a location Blake had once visited, a symbol pulled from one of his old case files. Even the choice of victims, seemingly random, had strange ties to past arrests and persons of interest Blake had once interrogated. "This guy's not sloppy," Vega told his new partner one night, staring at the photos taped to his office wall. "He's smart, too smart. He's building something, and we're already in the middle of it." Still, the department was overwhelmed. A killer was making a mockery of them, taunting them with blood clues and childish jokes scrawled in spray paint or permanent marker. Closer, not quite. Cold. Graffiti like breadcrumbs, red ink messages sent to news stations. One reporter even received a manila envelope containing a single Polaroid of one of the crime scenes, taken before the police had even arrived. The Laughing Man was always one step ahead, sometimes two. What disturbed Vega most wasn't the chaos, it was the control. Each murder wasn't just a kill, it was a page in a larger story, a sequence, an evolution. Like the killer was composing a symphony of fear and frustration with the police as his unwilling orchestra. Public pressure mounted. The mayor demanded answers. The press spun wild theories. Some blamed the department, others blamed the city's moral decay. Protesters began gathering outside precincts, holding up signs like, "Catch the laugh before he laughs again." But nothing worked. Every time they thought they had a lead, it evaporated. A false ID. A planted print. A tip from someone who disappeared the next day. And still the bodies kept coming. Every detective in the department began to dread the call. The one that said a new scene had been found, a new victim, a new message. And in the silence of his apartment, Daniel Vega reopened Blake Turner's file again. Because part of him, deep down, was starting to wonder, was this monster connected to the man they lost 4 years ago? Or worse, was this the monster who took him? The Laughing Man didn't just kill, he humiliated. By the 5th body, the NYPD was already on edge. By the 8th, they were unraveling. Detectives swarmed every crime scene like ants, snapping photos, lifting prints, sketching blood splatter patterns, digging into databases, arresting every man within 5 blocks who looked suspicious. But for every ounce of effort, they got nothing real in return. The evidence was always off. One set of fingerprints matched a man who died in 1972. Another matched a cop still active on the force, who passed 2 lie detectors and hadn't left Staten Island in weeks. Hair samples belonged to non-existent blood types. Boot prints measured 10 sizes too large for any suspect nearby. It wasn't sloppiness, it was sabotage. Whoever this man was, he didn't just want to evade capture, he wanted them to chase ghosts. And they did. Lead after lead turned out to be a dead end, each more absurd than the last. At one crime scene, they found a burner phone ringing in a victim's pocket. When an officer answered it, a child's voice, digitized and warped, sang "Ring Around the Rosie" before cutting to static. The number was untraceable. At another scene, a decapitated body was propped up at a diner booth, coffee poured into its lap. A crossword puzzle filled in perfectly on the table. Every answer a reference to cold cases Blake Turner once worked. One by one, detectives began to feel it. They weren't solving a crime. They were being pulled into a story, a sick, twisting narrative being written in real time. Every moment wasted wasn't just a setback, it was part of the killer's performance. He was watching them, manipulating them, feeding them just enough to feel close, then yanking it away like a cruel magician. Detective Daniel Vega felt it worst of all. He'd been through bloodbaths before. He'd seen what desperation looked like, but this wasn't desperation. This was orchestration. The killer had the city on strings, and Vega could feel the tension in every breath. "You ever get the feeling he's already solved the case?" Vega asked his partner one night, staring at the whiteboard. "Like, we're the ones being studied?" His partner didn't answer. He just looked at the photos pinned on the wall. 8 victims, 8 clues, 8 carefully designed crime scenes that each felt more like a taunt than a tragedy. At the precinct, morale sank. Investigators turned on each other. Some whispered about moles in the department. Others believed the Laughing Man was one of them, a cop, maybe even a detective. How else could he know so much? How else could he think the way they did? "He doesn't just know our methods," Vega muttered. "He understands our instincts." Twice they thought they had him. The first was a man named Calvin Rooks, former mental patient, found in an abandoned subway tunnel with a journal filled with graphic fantasies. But every alibi checked out. The photos in his possession had been clipped from newspapers. The most damning evidence, a knife, turned out to be planted. When pressed, Calvin cried like a child. The second suspect hanged himself before interrogation. No note, no history of mental illness. Just a single word carved into his chest. Wrong. After that, the department tightened up. Every briefing was behind closed doors. Reports were handwritten again. No digital trails. Still, it didn't matter. The Laughing Man was always one step ahead. A fresh victim would turn up within hours. And there'd be another message, one on a bathroom wall. Detectives are just blind poets in a crime story they didn't write. Another scrawled in lipstick on a mirror. Cold hands, warm heart, wrong again. Every crime scene felt like déjà vu. Vega began to lose sleep. He replayed the evidence in his head like broken film. He stopped going home. He missed meals. His wife left him a voicemail every night, asking him to come back. He didn't answer. He couldn't, not while the killer was still writing the ending. But it was clear now. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was a stage. And the department wasn't the audience. They were part of the act. A sick, brilliant act where every clue was bait. Every mistake was intentional. Every failure was anticipated. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a message. And the worst part was, no one knew who it was for. The night air was thick with fog and the distant hum of city life when James Calloway woke up tied to a cold metal chair. His wrists burned where the coarse ropes bit into his skin. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He didn't know how long he'd been there. Hours. Days. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. The smell of damp concrete and rust filled the air. Panic rose in his throat like bile, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to think clearly. He had heard the stories on the news, the killings, the messages left behind, the taunts from the elusive killer the media called the Laughing Man. He had tried to keep his head down, to stay invisible, but somehow the nightmare had found him. His captor hadn't been kind. The bruises on James's face told their own story. The blood dried on his arms was proof of failed escape attempts. He knew what was coming next, the same fate as the others. But this time, something snapped inside him. A primal urge to survive overpowered the fear. He had been quietly studying the knots binding him. With trembling fingers, he worked at the frayed edges, using a shard of broken glass he'd hidden earlier. The ropes finally gave way with a soft snap. James didn't hesitate. He stood, legs weak but determined, and stumbled toward the door. He paused, listening. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heart pounding, he threw the door open and sprinted into the darkness beyond. Outside, the city's noises swallowed him up, the screech of tires, the distant sirens, the chatter of late-night pedestrians. He ran, blood dripping from scraped knees, as if the city itself was urging him forward. Finally, he found a phone booth and dialed 911 with shaking hands. "Help!" he gasped into the receiver. "Please, I'm at 34 Essex Street. I escaped. There's a man. He's a killer." Within minutes, police cars screeched into the street. Officers rushed into the building behind James, weapons drawn. Detective Daniel Vega was among them. He had been working the case for years, haunted by the ghost of Blake Turner and the escalating trail of murders. When he heard the call, he felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with cautious hope. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? The officers secured the building, searching room by room. In the dim light, they found evidence of horrors too brutal to describe. A torture chamber meticulously arranged, photos of past victims pinned to the walls, symbols Blake Turner had once examined. But most haunting of all was the locked closet. Inside, amidst broken boxes and hanging coats, they found something that made Vega's breath catch, a perfectly preserved detective's uniform, Blake Turner's. The room fell silent. Vega's mind raced. The man they had hunted, the man who had vanished and died mysteriously, had been connected to this monster all along. James, still trembling, was led to safety. He gave a detailed description of his captor, a man methodical, cold, and terrifyingly intelligent. The NYPD prepared for the takedown. The city held its breath. For the first time in 4 years, justice seemed within reach. The raid started just before dawn. The sun hadn't yet crested the city skyline, and the streets were still quiet. Police cruisers with flashing lights surrounded the old brick apartment building on Essex Street. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation and something darker. Detective Daniel Vega led the team up the narrow staircase, every step echoing in the hollow hallway. The suspect's door was at the end, plain and unassuming. Nothing hinted at the nightmare waiting beyond. "Breach and clear," Vega ordered. Officers kicked down the door. The first thing that hit them was the smell, a sickly mix of decay and iron. It was the kind of stench that made the stomach turn and the skin crawl. Inside, the apartment was a macabre shrine. Walls were plastered with photos, dozens of them, pictures of victims, crime scenes, and disturbing close-ups that made it clear this wasn't just about murder, it was obsession. Bloodstains marked the hardwood floors, dried into dark, cracked patterns that told stories of struggle and pain. Scattered on a dusty table were personal items, wallets, jewelry, watches, all trophies taken from those who had crossed the killer's path. But nothing prepared them for the closet. A small, dimly lit space, it looked ordinary until Vega noticed the locked trunk pushed against the back wall. The lock was old but sturdy, and the killer had clearly taken care to keep it sealed. One of the officers pried it open. Inside lay a treasure trove of horror and heartbreak. Folded neatly was a full detective's uniform, the navy jacket with silver buttons gleaming faintly in the dim light, creased pants, and polished boots. Hanging beside it was the badge, a shining star etched with the name Blake Turner. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Vega stepped forward slowly, his breath catching. Here was the truth, hidden for years. The man who had vanished in 1987. The detective who had been found floating in the river, stripped bare and without explanation. His killer had not only murdered him, but had kept his clothes, his identity, as a trophy. The uniform was preserved as if sacred, untouched by time or decay. It was a chilling tribute and a brutal reminder of the killer's twisted mind. "This isn't just a shrine," Vega whispered. "It's a statement." The killer had claimed victory over the one man who had stood in his way, the one man who might have stopped the bloodshed. Vega's team searched the rest of the closet. More trophies emerged: handcuffs, knives, even Blake's old notebook, stained and torn but still intact. Pages filled with notes, sketches, and case details, secrets the killer had kept close. Vega flipped through it, heart pounding. Here were clues, stories, and moments from Blake's life preserved in ink and paper, trapped in the grasp of a madman. The discovery hit everyone hard. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. They had been chasing shadows and red herrings for years, but now they had the proof that Blake Turner's death was the beginning of something far worse. That the killer's madness was fueled by obsession with the detective's legacy. Outside, the city woke to breaking news. Reporters gathered, eager for answers. The badge, the uniform, the grisly shrine. It was a story that shook the city's core. Maria Turner, Blake's mother, arrived at the precinct that afternoon. When she saw the photos and heard the news, her face crumpled in a mixture of grief and relief. "He wasn't just lost," she said quietly. "He was taken, and now, maybe he can finally rest." Detectives stood in the apartment's shadow long after the raid ended. They knew the fight wasn't over, but the closet shrine was the key, the darkest chapter finally laid bare. Vega looked at the uniform one last time before it was packed away. He vowed silently that Blake's story, and his own, would end with justice, because this time they had the truth. The city was electric the day the trial began. For years, New York had been haunted by the unsolved murders, the whispers of a killer who had eluded justice. Now, at last, the man who called himself the Laughing Man stood behind bars, his dark secrets spilling into the glaring light of the courtroom. Detective Daniel Vega sat at the front row, eyes fixed on the defendant. The man looked smaller now, stripped of his arrogance, his smirk gone. His face was pale, almost ghostly, beneath the harsh courtroom lights. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a chilling picture of a calculated predator who had stalked the city with cold precision. But the most haunting revelation came from the killer's own journals, thick notebooks filled with handwriting so neat it seemed obsessive, bordering on fanatical. The entries detailed how he had followed Blake Turner for weeks before the murder, studying his habits, tracking his movements, learning his weaknesses. He didn't see Blake as an enemy, the journal said, but as something far darker, a worthy sacrifice. To the killer, the lead prosecutor told the court, Detective Turner was not merely a victim, he was a symbol, a man who represented justice itself. The defendant believed that by taking Blake's life, he could assert control over the chaos he saw in the world. The defense attorneys tried to shift the narrative. Their strategy was familiar: insanity. They called in psychologists to testify that the killer suffered from a severe dissociative disorder, that he was detached from reality during the murders. They argued he was a danger to himself as much as to others, and needed treatment, not prison. But the jury was unmoved. The evidence was overwhelming: the careful planning, the taunts, the meticulous preservation of Blake's uniform. These were acts of calculation, not madness. Throughout the trial, witnesses testified about the fear the killer had spread, the lives shattered, the families left grieving. And they spoke of Blake Turner's legacy, the detective who had dedicated his life to justice, only to become a victim of the darkness he fought. Maria Turner rarely left the courtroom. Her face was drawn but resolute. She sat with her hands folded, sometimes wiping tears when the defense tried to minimize her son's life. Yet she never broke. The city followed every twist and turn. The newspapers dubbed it the trial of the century. Editorials debated the balance between justice and mercy. The public waited with bated breath. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. The words hit like a thunderclap. The killer's face twisted with rage, but held no surprise. He had expected this, perhaps even welcomed it. The judge's sentence was swift and uncompromising: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Maria Turner, the verdict was a fragile bomb. After years of unanswered questions and shattered hope, there was closure. Not the kind that erased the pain, but the kind that allowed healing to begin. She stood outside the courthouse later that day, her voice steady but soft. "Blake fought for justice. Now, justice has been done. I can finally breathe." Detective Vega watched her from a distance. He thought of the years lost, of every dead end and every sleepless night. And yet, here they were, a verdict, a sentence, a moment of peace in a long nightmare. Still, he knew the city would never forget Blake Turner, not the boy from the Bronx who saw evil too early, nor the detective who refused to let killers walk free. In a quiet corner of the city, a memorial was planned, a statue, a plaque, a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, would come. As the sun set behind the skyline, Detective Vega looked up and whispered, "Rest now, Blake. We've got it from here." Years had passed since the trial that brought the killer to justice. The city moved on, as it always does, its streets bustling, its skyline ever-changing. But some things refused to fade away. Some stories, no matter how dark, became beacons. Blake Turner's name was one of those stories. At the NYPD Training Academy, new recruits learned of Blake long before they ever saw the streets. His cases were studied as examples of courage, intelligence, and relentless pursuit of truth. His life was a lesson in resilience, a boy from the Bronx who refused to let his past define him, who stared down the darkest corners of the city and fought to bring light. In classrooms filled with eager faces, instructors spoke of Blake not just as a detective, but as a symbol of what it meant to stand up when others turned away. His story was told alongside tales of triumph and tragedy, a reminder that the badge wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a promise. Out on the streets, older officers still spoke his name quietly in moments of reflection. They shared memories of the man who could read a crime scene like a book, who never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against him. Maria Turner had become a quiet force in the community. She worked tirelessly with victims' families, sharing Blake's story to inspire hope and justice. Her grief had not disappeared, it never would, but it had transformed into a mission. At the annual memorial service held near the Hudson River, officers gathered to honor the fallen detective. The statue erected in his memory stood tall, a bronze figure mid-stride, badge gleaming against the backdrop of the city skyline. Children, many from the same neighborhoods Blake once called home, laid flowers and listened to stories about the hero who never backed down. The river that had taken Blake's body remained a solemn reminder of sacrifice and the fragility of life. But to those who remembered, it was also a place of peace, a place where justice had finally found its voice. Detective Daniel Vega, now a captain, often visited the memorial. He would stand silently, eyes closed, feeling the weight of the past and the hope of the future. "Justice echoes," he would say softly. "It never truly dies." And in the quiet moments, Vega believed Blake was still watching over the city, still fighting, still guiding, even from beyond. The city never forgot Blake Turner. His name was carved into its history, etched into the hearts of those who knew what it meant to fight for what was right. The boy from the Bronx, who had once seen a killer walk free and vowed never to let it happen again, had become more than a man. He was a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Because some stories don't end with darkness, they end with light.